Hello everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at the first part of Immanuel Kant's only possible demonstration for the existence of God. That's not the name exactly, but it's a dumb long name, so I won't be repeating it. This is the book where Kant puts forward his own argument for God's existence, and also offers a refutation of other versions or arguments for God's existence. In fact, the basic idea of his refutation of the ontological argument will be found in his analysis of existence in this book. Okay, first we're going to look at the preface. Now, he says that arguments for God's existence are not necessary. Most people just know God exists when they're not being obnoxious, but we know we're writing for philosophers. We're interested in knowledge, so we should look at an argument for God's existence. Second, he says metaphysics is hard. He's probably gotten something wrong. Please forgive him. However, he's been very careful, and he thinks that what he's written here is very good. And then he has the three different parts of the book: the basis for the proof, the usefulness of the proof, and that no other proof is possible. These correspond to the three parts of the book. Today we're only going to be looking at part one, which is the basis for the proof. This is the part I find interesting. I might go over the other parts of the book at some future point, but for now we're just going to stay with part one, in which the basis for the demonstration is provided. This will be broken up into a series of observations. So observation one is on existence in general. First, Kant gives us a disclaimer. The analysis here of existence is not exhaustive. In fact, there will be no actual strict definition of what existence is. Even though there's no definition that Kant can provide us, though, there are still many things that we can know with certainty about existence, the same way that maybe you don't know what space itself is, but you know that if you're in space, you're probably in relation to other things that are in space. Space has this idea of relationality built into it. So even if you don't know what existence is, you can know a certain number of things about it. The first one is that it's not a normal determination. To get at what he means here, you can just think of an example like, I have a car, and you're like, okay, and then I say, oh, and my car is green, and it has 6 wheels, and it's 10 feet tall, and there's 3 crying children in it, and it's like, okay, well, now I've got a lot more information about the car. Originally, I just had the idea that you had a car, but it was very undetermined, but with each new piece of information you added a determination on the car. Now, when Kant is talking about determinations, or what he calls predicates, he's talking about properties like being green, being blue, being 5'11", being human, being a rat, being a rock. These are going to be made up of a certain set of properties and determinations on a given object. So he's going to say that whatever existence is, it isn't one of these determinations. It isn't a property that a thing has. He'll say it isn't a predicate that a thing has. So for something to be a determination, it needs to add some kind of conceptual content to the essence. This would, of course, refute ontological arguments or at least the Anselmian ontological argument, because it would assume that existence is a predicate that can be said of an individual, in the same way that being red or being tall could be said of an individual. So when you say something like, there are hexagons that exist in nature, Kant is going to want to say that the properties thought of connected to the name hexagon are instantiated in nature. He has a very similar view to Frege and Russell here, where his idea of what it means for a thing to exist is closely connected, if not the same as, an individual's instantiation of a nature. So when you say hexagons exist, what you're actually saying is there are some things that instantiate the property of being hexagons. Existence as the copula. So in affirmative statements that take the form of something like X is F, Bob is human, the rock is hard, the water is wet, you have the subject, the predicate, and the copula. The copula is the connection between the subject and the predicate. So, X is F, the rock is hard. So Kant sees existence as the copula between some individual and the property the individual has. He'll also say that it's the positing of a predicate of a subject. So, the positing of the rock is hard, or the hard rock, is what he's talking about. The actual kind of like presence of the hard rock is what it is for the rock to be hard. Existence is the positing of the property here. So Kant is going to say that nothing more is posited in an actual individual rather than a hypothetical individual. He's rather going to say, or at least the way he phrases it, is that something more is posited through the actual individual rather than the possible individual. The possible individual is just a series or an abstract series of properties that are related to each other, whereas the actual individual is something which has those properties. Okay, observation 2 on internal possibility insofar as it presupposes existence. So first, Kant is going to want to draw a distinction between what he calls formal and material possibility. Formal possibility is the logical side of possibility. This just has to do with whether something is contradictory. So if you think of the phrase, the tall human, nothing about that is contradictory. But if you take the phrase, the square circle, you're going to have a contradiction because a square and a circle generate incompatible shapes. So a square circle is formally impossible because there is a logical contradiction just in the predicates that the object has, the square circle. So contradictory things are formally impossible. However, a right triangle, or a triangle with a right angle, is possible. So both of the parts, the triangle and the right angle that it has, are possible, and they are also possible together. So you can have a right angle, a triangle, and you can have a triangle that has a right angle. They're compossible. So the material possibility is kind of the aspects that build up the formal possibility. They're the things about the world which can be thought to be like compossible or coherent with each other. So the square and the circle in the formal impossibility are actually both materially possible. You can have a square, you can have a circle. In fact, they exist in the world. Though that's the material out of which we take this idea of possibility from, but the triangle and the right angle are materially possible individually, and they're formally possible as a single object, a thing which is a right triangle. So it's kind of like the building blocks of formal possibility are a material possibility. And then formal possibility is whether the material possibilities either contradict each other or they fail to contradict each other. Next, we have that possibility presupposes existence. If there is nothing, then there are no subjects to be the material of formal possibility. So if there was nothing, then possibility would be abolished, making everything impossible. You need the material for formal possibility for anything to be possible at all. You can't have actual possibility from nothing because there's no material to constitute the formal possibilities. So Kant is going to say from this that it it's probably impossible that there's nothing. But before we get to that, we're going to want to look a little bit more at the different types of possibility and impossibility. Kant is very insistent on noting here that actually the existence of nothing is formally possible. Formally, there's no contradiction in the idea of nothing. Because for there to be a contradiction in the idea of nothing, there would need to be some kind of essence which had existing as part of its essence. However, because existing is not a predicate, nothing is capable of having existing as part of its essence, which means that the formal impossibility of nothing is null and void. There's no such thing as a formal impossibility of nothing, because it's impossible for there to be an essence that simply includes existence. Okay, next we have possibility and actuality. So possibility in total and each particular possibility presuppose something actual. There has to be something around for it to be possible that something else happens. You need material for the formal possibility. Now, there are two different kinds of things Kant is going to want to talk about, two relations that something can have to actuality. There are those things which are only conceivable as actual, so if you think of them, you can only think of them as if they exist. And then there are things that are possible only because something else is actual. So I'm only possible because, my matter exists. I was caused by, someone else. Or other people, but you can't have me without having me being built up out of matter and form, or me without me being caused by other people. Now, examples of the first type are limited. Kant says that there's only one such thing, which is possible and conceivable only as, actually existing. This is what Kant is going to say is the ground of all possibility. But he's going to leave that aside for now. Next, we have these two principles. One is the principle of non-contradiction, which is the foundation of formal possibility. The other is the actual foundation of material possibility. So you need something actual in the world for things to be materially possible, and you need a lack of contradiction in the kinds of things you're talking about for things to be formally possible. Now we get on to observation 3, which is about positively necessary existence. So, hypothetically, according to Kant, something exists of necessity, but what can be drawn? What argument can be given to think that something is positively necessary if it's impossible for something to include existence in the kind of thing that it is? Right, so Kant is going to say, is it a contradiction? Is it because there's a contradiction in the denial of a necessary being? But like I said earlier, because existence isn't a predicate, it isn't included in the kind of thing, so there won't be a contradiction in the predicates if we say that there is no necessarily existing thing. The non-existent necessary thing isn't a contradiction because existence just isn't a predicate in that way. So formal possibility and impossibility would be a basis incapable of providing an actual reason to think that a thing necessarily exists. So formal possibility is a dud for deriving the actual existence of something. However, Kant thinks that material possibility is capable of providing us with this necessary ammo for thinking that there is a necessary being. So if something was formally necessary, its opposite would have to involve a contradiction, which we know isn't the case. But there could be a thing which makes everything else impossible. So say object X fails to exist, and that destroys all of material possibility. Well, if this thing could fail to exist, then material possibility would also fail to exist, because it itself would be included in this in some way. Because it's possible that if it wasn't possible, it wouldn't be actual. So Kant is going to say that maybe there's a kind of thing which kind of contains or grounds all material possibility, and if it failed to exist, then all material possibility would also be impossible. And this is the kind of necessity that Kant thinks is actually present. There has to be at least one thing, at least at this point, there has to be at least one thing which is necessary so that other things are possible. There has to be at least one thing which is capable of causing other things to exist, just so other things can be possible. If there was something that failed to exist in every possible world, that was the ground or source of the possibility in that world, then there would also be a failure of possible things to be possible in every world. Possibility would have to be something which is non-necessary, which is variable across worlds, and Kant thinks that's incorrect. So now I just want to take a quick aside. This argument is very, very similar to some other arguments that I'm a fan of. One I've presented on this channel before, which was a modal version of Aquinas' third way. And it's also similar to the modal position, or the position in modality in the ground of modal language that Graham Oppy and Alexander Proust take, which is that there is a necessary being at the common causal history of every possible world. And, by extension, they would also have this idea that there's necessary being or beings as at the source of the formal as well as material possibility of each possible world. Okay, next we're going to have a quick look at the kinds of contingency and necessity. I know I'm repeating myself a bit here, but this is what Kant does in the text, and this is my book report on Kant. So for formal necessity, X is formally necessary when its opposite is a logical contradiction, and X is materially necessary when its opposite annuls or destroys all material possibility. And while God is not formally necessary for Kant, he is materially necessary. And then X is formally contingent when its opposite is not a logical contradiction, and it is materially contingent when its opposite does not destroy all material possibility. Okay, so we've looked at a broad outline for Kant's idea of modality and his kind of argument for there being at least one, possibly more necessary beings. Let's look at his arguments for the divine attributes. First, there's the argument for unicity. Now, to understand this first, we have to remember, again, that material possibility of everything is supposed to be grounded in these necessary beings. So Kant says, assume two necessary beings. They are both the ground of all possibility. If B is possible, and it is because it exists, then its possibility is grounded in A. And, it's like a consequence of A. Maybe it's caused by A. But as a necessary being, B is also the ground of possibility. And it should be causing A. It can't be a consequence of something else, because possibility and being caused, to be caused you have to be possible first. So B can't be a simply possible being which is caused by another, but A can't be caused by another. So the possibility of A and the possibility of B would kind of be contained in the other, and they would each be caused by the other, which is impossible for both of them. So Kant is going to say that there can only be one necessary being. His argument for simplicity is a little bit more convoluted, and I think a little bit less coherent. He goes, if only one part is necessary and all the others are contingent, then God is just creating a bunch of essentially unrelated substances. So, God must be simple, because whatever substance he creates, which isn't just himself, is just going to be that, a separate substance. Now, if you say that there are multiple necessary parts of God, well, these are just going to contradict the earlier argument from unicity. We already know that there's only one necessary being, and saying that there are multiple necessary parts would contradict that. And then finally, if there were multiple parts of a whole, that is, where each of the parts is contingent, but the whole is necessary, Kant thinks that this is impossible for two reasons. One is that the modal status of the whole, in this way, can't be different from the status of the parts. If the parts are contingent, the whole is also contingent. The second is that the parts are actually capable of failing to exist, but the parts are also supposed to ground material possibility. So if the parts are capable of being destroyed, then you could just destroy part of God, and part of possibility itself would go out of existence. Material possibility would simply disappear, which Kant thinks is nonsense, and I'm inclined to agree with him. I don't know if the first argument of the three here actually works, but I do agree with the other two. Okay, then we have immutability and eternality. Kant is going to say that it is only possible through its existence, because the necessary being is the ground of all possibility. It itself is only possibility because it exists. And because it exists, it has to be possible. There's no way for you to get into that tight circle there and cut it off and keep it from existing. So there's no way for you to change it from existing to non-existing. So it will necessarily exist for all eternity. He also says that it's incapable of change, because if it was capable of change, then it would be capable of, in part, going into existence or going out of existence, which it can't. So it has to be immutable. You can kind of back this up with an argument from simplicity. Like if you thought the argument for simplicity works, and God actually has no parts, then God is just simply incapable of change, because all change in God would be a change of God's parts. Then he argues for infinite perfection. Because God is the cause of all things, and he is kind of like the source of all things, then God either has every perfection formally or eminently. So formally would just mean that he has the perfection kind of this embodied, the way that most things have perfections when you think about them. Like I have the perfection of having a will and an intellect, and it's like I actually have those. And then eminently is to say that God has the power to cause those things. So maybe God doesn't have redness within him, but he has the power to cause red things. Now, Kant asks, okay, does this mean there are privations in God? Does this mean God has some kind of evil in him? Because God is also capable of causing evil things. And he actually says no, because the privation is going to be based on the substances that God causes. So God causes the substances, but he doesn't cause the privations in the substances, because you can't cause a lack of something in that way. Then we move to observation 4. This is the argument for a demonstration of the existence of God. I don't know why it's named that. It's just the finisher. So he says that God has an intellect and a will, mostly based, interestingly enough, off of perfect being theology. He says that having an intellect and a will is more perfect absolutely than not having them. And because God is perfect, God is the most perfect thing, having all perfections formally and eminently, it would be worse for him to have no intellect and no will. So he must have an intellect and a will. I think personally this argument is bad. I agree with Scotus's argument against it, which you can find in Duns Scotus on God by Richard Cross, a good book. And then he says finally that there is an evident plan in the laws of nature that must come from a mind, because all plans are from minds. So because nature obviously has this rational structure, there must also be a mind which created nature. So, assuming you thought all of Kant's arguments worked, then there is a single necessary, simple, immutable, eternal, infinitely perfect mind that is the ground of all possibility and the cause of all actual reality. That's God is another word for that, if you ask me. Now, like I said, after about the single part, or maybe the single and necessary part, I would probably get off. If I wanted to use an argument like this, I would use different supports for simplicity, immutability, the eternality, and the infinite perfection. Well, the infinite perfection one is actually kind of interesting. I would probably modify it a little bit, but that one could work. But either way, it's a very interesting argument, if nothing else. And I just find it really fascinating that this argument that Kant gave is very, very similar to the modal version of the third way and the book-length argument that Alexander Proust gives in his book on modality. Anyway, I hope you've learned something.